and welcome to Games as Lit 101. I think we can all agree that action-oriented stories still have plenty of potential for depth and meaning. We've seen a good amount of excellent war films, and the last few decades have seen an influx of films that combine heart-pounding action with some interesting ideas and deep, well-written characters. At this point in the popular scene of media criticism, one who doesn't recognize that a story can be both action-packed and thought-provoking is generally considered pretentious and stuffy. And really, this approach is nothing new. I mean, we consider Shakespeare the height of literary greatness, and have you actually seen any of his plays? They're full of murder, sex, war, and so many penis jokes.
Thou hast undone our mother!
Villain, I have done thy mother.
And once you get past the old-timey language, it becomes clear that however good his plays are, and they are incredibly good, they're pretty clearly aimed at the populace. Shakespeare wrote popular schlock to entertain the masses, and the snobby, high-art critics of his time didn't even like him. He was like the Michael Bay of his time, if Michael Bay was also a master filmmaker. Or, at least competent. Sometimes the best way to get people to think with a work of art is to appeal to the lowest common denominator, but include ideas that will get through to people. Wrap sustenance in a nice candy shell so people can easily enjoy it, and hopefully get something positive out of it while they're at it. Considering video games still rarely cast off the candy shell at all, this medium has actually gotten pretty good at that over time. But sometimes that candy shell gets so big and thick that there's barely any sustenance left. You can tell where it was supposed to be, and there might even be some remnants of it somewhere in there, but it's all but lost in the wake of so much sweet nothing. Today, we talk about Gears of War. Gears of War was created by Epic Games and designed by Cliff Bleszinski, most famous for designing the Unreal Tournament series. Gears of War released in 2006 to wide acclaim. It was praised for its cover-based gameplay before that became the norm for first-person shooters. It wasn't technically the first game to do it, but it was the first to refine it to this degree, and it popularized the concept as a result. So yeah, we can thank Gears of War for the basic mechanics of nearly every third-person shooter out there today. And now the Gears of War Ultimate Edition is set to release on the Xbox One tomorrow, as of the day of this episode's release. What did not get much praise was its story, and yeah, there's pretty good reason for that. As we'll see, and as most of you are probably aware whether or not you've even played the games, Gears of War is less about a gripping sci-fi war narrative and more just about ripping monsters apart with chainsaws. It's a game about impossibly muscle-bound men being all tough and manly and immovable and making snappy dialogue in the face of unbelievable horrors. It's almost as much a poster child for dude bro gaming culture as Call of Duty, if only for how absurdly over-the-top testosterone-laden it is. But would you believe there's actually more to it than that? Or at least that there's supposed to be. In an interview with Ben Kuchera at GDC 2012, Cliff Bleszinski said, "Gears was always meant to be a lot more Band of Brothers than Predator, and that's one of the things that, in hindsight, if I could go back and change, I would. The characters didn't need to be huge, although it turned out to be an iconic thing. I never stood in front of the company and said I wanted to see the biggest, most macho motherfuckers you could ever see. That never happened. The character design happened completely organically. A little bit of the heart got lost in that process, and then it became a negative stereotype in this generation. I want to be smarter about that in the future." He even said that he felt the darkness and violence of the series may have been due to the failing of his first marriage, which happened around the time they were creating the first game. And it's a fitting inspiration for a game that takes place in a world such as this, that used to be so beautiful but now is so devastated. And you need look no further than the game's own advertising to see some of its artistic aspiration.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces. Hide my head, I wanna drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow. And I find it kinda funny, I find it kinda sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad world. Mad world.
And if you're paying close enough attention throughout the series, you can see it. You can see some of the more philosophical themes the games are trying to go for. You can see the character development it wanted to achieve, but it all too rarely actually delivers on any of that with any particular meaning. Which of course makes it quite interesting to talk about, so that's exactly what we're gonna do. Unfortunately, this turned out to be a way bigger project than I expected, so I've actually split this analysis into 4 separate videos to be released over the course of the next 2 weeks. So today I'm going to be going over the first game and summarizing the story, as well as talking about some of the themes and story threads that are going to be important later on. On Thursday, I'll do the same to Gears of War 2, next Monday I'll do it to Gears of War 3, and then after that I'll wrap things up that next Thursday with a final analysis that goes over all of the themes and important story threads of the series in a bit more detail, and talk also about how sometimes the story kind of fails to actually mean what it wants to. So it's my hope that these next 3 episodes are going to serve as not just a reminder of the story, but also as setup for the analysis that I'll be doing in that final episode. I should note that Gears of War is rated M for mature, and the games have a lot of strong language and way more graphic violence. Now, I try to keep Games as Lit 101 appropriate for all ages, so I'm not going to go shoving digital guts in your face, but it is kind of impossible to actually talk about this series without including and discussing some of those elements. So just be aware that that's going to be a thing over the course of these 4 videos. Anyway, let's get going. The first game in particular is a story of high potential, but absolutely no payoff, so let's just dive into it and you'll see what I mean. A brief cutscene informs us that the humans of the planet Sera knew peace until Emergence Day, when strange and formidable creatures, referred to as the Locust, burst out from under the planet's surface and killed the vast majority of the planet's population. And humanity, predictably enough, is having a lot of trouble surviving this onslaught of terrible foes. We're then introduced to our protagonist, Marcus Phoenix, who's voiced by Jake the Dog, Bender, Waka, John DiMaggio. He's in prison for some reason. The game will explain this later, I'm sure. But he gets broken out by his buddy Dominic Santiago because things are just that bad now. They meet up with a gruff sergeant type.
You! Traitor like you doesn't deserve to wear the uniform.
Okay, seriously, why do all sergeants sound the same in these games? Well, okay, technically he's a colonel, but still, you could just replace his lines with Sarge from Red vs. Blue, and the only real difference would be making this game significantly funnier.
Killing a man with your bare hands says we're all equals as men. Except I'm slightly more equal because I'm still alive and you're dead.
Anyway, they need to go check on a squad that was trying to deliver a resonator device that could map the Locust tunnels. During this process, we get a few interesting bits of dialogue.
Are you the Marcus Phoenix? The one who fought at Aspfield Fields?
Yep.
Wow, cool!
Not really.
This building used to be a beautiful place. There's a lot of history here.
A lot of lies, too.
Oh, you've got some nerve, soldier. I know all about your trial.
This trial was a sham, sir.
Well, that's interesting. I guess Marcus is kind of a war hero, but was unjustly imprisoned for one thing or another? That's pretty interesting. I look forward to learning more about that. The squad they were after turns out to be mostly dead, but they do meet up with a few survivors, including Cole, who used to play thrashball before E-Day threw the planet into war. Okay, that's kind of cool. I really like this concept for a character. I'd be interested in knowing what brought him from a life of fame and luxury into a military career, and for that matter, how he copes with everything when his major pastime and career isn't really possible anymore in this time of war. I really look forward to finding out more about this character. To get to the location where they need to plant the resonator, they need to get a vehicle, which Dom gets by talking to a guy he knows in a stranded ghetto. Stranded, huh? Wonder why these guys are out here all alone. I mean, they obviously don't like the COG soldiers, so there must be some kind of tension there, I guess. And for that matter, Dom says he knows someone here because he's looking for someone, and the guy they talk to mentions his lady friend, so who's Dom looking for, and why are all these people out here anyway? Yeah, I'm sure the story will explain at some point. When they do plant the resonator, it doesn't work. The Locust tunnels are simply far bigger than they expected, and it can't map them all. But Baird apparently just finds some device that already has a small portion of the tunnels mapped, for some reason. The device came from the Phoenix estate, Marcus's father's house. Whoa, okay, that's weird. So I guess we'll find out more about Marcus now, since we're going to what I assume is his childhood home. And is it just me, or is it really strange that his father would have information on the Locust tunnels that even the military doesn't have access to? This brings up a lot of interesting questions, which I'm sure the game will get to later. They go to the Phoenix estate and discover a secret laboratory with a complete map of the Locust tunnels. So they leave and use a giant bomb to blow all the tunnels up. The end. Seriously? I mean, for real. We're going to get some genuinely interesting little tidbits, just tiny little hints, about 3 of our main characters, and not actually give them any real development? And for that matter, we're going to bring up that Marcus's dad apparently has some kind of connection with the Locust that no one else really knew about, and no one's gonna expand on that, or, even just question it a little? I mean, what? This is the biggest problem with the first Gears of War, and unfortunately is a problem that, though vastly improved over the other games, still kind of continues over the course of the series. The story is told competently enough, sometimes, but it never really does anything particularly worthwhile. I mean, the entire story of this first game could be summed up in a single sentence. Evil creatures attack humans, so humans map their tunnels and blow them up, the end. But literally nothing else of merit happens. But the sad thing is, it's not entirely for lack of trying. I mean, there are actually a lot of interesting elements of this game that I genuinely wanted to know more about. The setting is interesting, the background is interesting, the characters, okay, have potential to be interesting, but nothing interesting is ever made of any of it. At all. And that just annoys me to no end. So let's fill in some of these blanks and see what I mean. Sarah had actually been at war very shortly before Emergence Day, between humans, obviously, since the Locust hadn't yet revealed themselves, which is when the aforementioned Battle of Aspho Fields took place. That conflict, known as the Pendulum Wars, was over a substance called emulsion, a very efficient and valuable energy source. We see it a lot in the game, but surprise surprise, its place in the story is only hinted at through a couple lines of dialogue, and otherwise it's basically just treated like lava or something. Marcus and Dom both fought in the Pendulum Wars, but of course E-Day changed everything. With humanity broken, an organization called the COG, the Coalition of Ordered Governments, rose up to begin providing food and shelter to those who joined up to fight, since they desperately needed soldiers and couldn't afford to provide for everyone. The Stranded are people who objected to this deal, and they see the COG as fascist and over-controlling. Dom and his wife, Maria, saw their 2 children die on E-Day, and overcome with grief, Maria settled into a dark depression and eventually just disappeared without a trace. That's who Dom is looking for. As for Marcus, in one of the early battles against the Locust, he disobeyed orders in order to try and save his father, which resulted in the death of many soldiers, the loss of the battle, and unfortunately he wasn't even able to save his dad. Thus, his prison sentence. These are all interesting elements of the world and the backstory, but not only does Gears of War refuse to develop them, in many cases it simply refuses to even inform us of them. It makes Destiny look like it was written by J.R.R. Tolkien in comparison. Which is really frustrating, because there are the seeds of some really good story ideas in here, and a lot of elements of the game are actually quite good. I mean, the game's presentation is hardly without merit. Despite the overly gray color palette, it actually has some pretty gorgeous architecture that makes one wonder how it must have looked before such ruin came to it, and I very much look forward to seeing these beautiful ruins in a bit more color and detail in the upcoming Ultimate Edition. The game also has some surprising horror overtones, portraying the Locust as genuinely tough and scary creatures and providing a number of genuinely tense situations. Leading to that tension is the simple fact that, for all the emphasis on action and violence, the game surprisingly often asks you to be patient or think through something, and the result is an occasionally surprisingly thoughtful experience of play that encourages careful action and further establishes a dark, intense atmosphere. My favorite example is the nighttime level, where vicious bat-like creatures called Krill are swarming around and you need to stay in the light to avoid getting completely torn apart. And the soundtrack is one of the most surprisingly good scores I've ever heard. I barely noticed it when I first played, but listening to it later it hit me how stunning and gorgeous it is. The events of the story can be really disjointed, and as a result they can be sometimes kind of confusing considering how simple they are. And while the story does bring some interesting ideas to the table, it fails to deliver on any of them. Gears of War is kind of like that one guy you know who's super obsessed with one thing or another, like we'll say toy soldiers in this case, and no matter what, yeah, you can talk to him about other things and you might get some interesting ideas out of him. He's not stupid, but no matter what, every conversation you have is going to go back to these toy soldiers, and you're just not going to get anywhere about anything else. It's a fairly inconsistent work that can't seem to decide whether it wants to be a science fiction war epic or a dark, atmospheric struggle through the post-apocalypse. It insists on a large scale, but it also follows a small group of soldiers, and it can't seem to bring these two disparate points into focus. But ultimately, it's quite clear that the game's priority was actually on neither of these concepts, but on the gameplay. The third-person cover shooting that still defines the third-person shooter genre to this day, and the simple satisfaction of sawing an evil creature in half with your chainsaw bayonet. Which is fine, but the fact that the game does actually have a level of narrative ambition opens it to literary criticism, and unfortunately it does fail to deliver on that front. All this is basically the entire reason I decided to tackle this whole trilogy in one go. The series does go to some interesting places, and I think it's important to acknowledge what it tried to accomplish and examine why it generally didn't do too good a job at actually doing it. But this first game just doesn't really give me anything. You know, for all of its engrossing presentation and dark atmosphere and its little hints at the story, it really just doesn't go anywhere. We can certainly look at the story and get some level of meaning, but it's all incidental, if you will. The fact that the only thing that really saves the day is brute force displays a philosophy that violence is the appropriate answer to problems like those posed in Gears of War, those being mostly the threat of actively aggressive attackers. Any other potential meaning held in the story was hinted at so vaguely and briefly, the story ends up saying absolutely nothing about them. There were hints of themes of political autonomy, relationships, injustice, desperation, secrecy, and even the small tragedies of war, and while all these come to some level of fruition over the course of the series, the first game is an absolute failure in exploring them, because it doesn't bother to even so much as present them, let alone actually say anything about them. And I truly wish I had more to say about the first Gears of War game, but I don't. There's just not much to talk about. It lays some interesting groundwork for the second and third games to work off of, but so lacks in meaningful storytelling itself that, I mean, really this first video just exists to establish the series, point out the types of things that it'll eventually be taking on, as well as the flaws that it's going to start out with, and that should let us get into some more detail in our future analysis. Thankfully, the sequel is much better and actually brings some clarity to the major themes of the series. It's not perfect, in fact it still has a lot of problems, but it does actually start exploring some of the stuff that this first game barely brought itself to even acknowledge, and it ends up being the strongest of the trilogy as a result, I believe. But we'll get to that in a couple days, and don't worry, there will be a lot more to talk about when we do. So in the meantime, feel free to follow Games as Literature on Twitter, like it on Facebook, and if you really enjoy the series, please consider supporting it on Patreon. All those links are down in the description. So, I'll see you in a few days. Class dismissed.